Hello, everyone, and welcome to the technical deep dive on managing metro regions to build back better. My name is Victor Mulas, and I am the team lead of the TDLC, the Tokyo Development Learning Center of the World Bank. I will be your moderator for today. Today is the third day of the week-long program, and the day when we open to the public the first part of this event via Vimeo streaming. Welcome to those of you joining us for the first time. As part of the TDLC's missions to share global and Japanese global knowledge and expertise, we are opening selected sessions of the technical deep dive to the wider audience of practitioners, experts, and other stakeholders interested in key urban development topics. We are live on Twitter and Facebook, and we will share key thoughts and ideas emerging from this event for the larger community of urban practitioners across the world. Please help us disseminate it what we learned today by also commenting and sharing your thoughts through the hashtag MetroRegionsTDD. The hashtag will appear in the chat for you. We have a great line of speakers and presentations for today, where we will be taking a forward-looking view and explore key priorities as cities came out of the pandemic. The first two sessions will be conducted in English, while the third one will be in both Japanese and English. If you are watching this as a public event through Vimeo, please refer to the instructions on how to access the translation posted in the Vimeo page. Now let's get started with our program today. Metro regions have witnessed one of the biggest challenges in decades, and in many cities we have to remake ourselves during the pandemic, adding new bike lanes, turning parking lots into cafes, closing down offices and shopping centers. Cities have evolved rapidly during the pandemic, and as organizations are starting to consider moving back to normal and having back the normal activity, reopening shops, offices, and creating a better path towards the city, we want our cities to rebuild in a better way. We want our cities to be greener, more affordable, more inclusive, and sustainable. Yet, as the pandemic has deeply changed our perceptions towards working and living in the city, cities require new thinking when it comes to building back better. The public sessions today explore these emerging considerations that help us navigate away from the pandemic uncertainties. Now, I would like to invite Joanna Masic, lead urban specialist of the World Bank, to moderate the first two sessions of the Open Day event. In these two sessions, we will first have an overview of good practices and policies to build back better, followed by a second session presenting the experience of London in their recovery program and Green New Deal mission. Joanna is the global lead for sustainable city infrastructure. She has over 20 years of experience in sustainable city investments and analytics, and previously she has worked at the Asian Development Bank and the government of the United Kingdom. Now, Joanna, welcome to the event. The floor is yours for the next two sessions.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's a pleasure to be here and to lead these sessions today, especially open to the public and also welcoming the country delegations that are part of this technical deep dive today. As Victor mentioned, the pandemic has really brought to the forefront the role of cities in both public health, but also in terms of the greening, the recovery, their role in mitigation and adaptation of climate change. And as Victor said, we have a really great lineup of speakers who are going to share what other metro regions are doing, from London to Tokyo to Kinshasa, to green the recovery process. So we want to start now, before we get into all these sessions, with a framing presentation. And we are lucky to have with us Professor Joan Fitzgerald. She's a professor of urban and public policy at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on urban climate action and strategies for linking to equity, economic development, and innovation. And she's written a book called Greenovation, so I will just plug that, which looks at climate strategies in many cities. Her findings are that there, rather than random acts of greenness, what cities need to be moving towards is aggressive actions on climate mitigation and adaptation. So I will pass over to Professor Joan for her presentation today, and then we'll come back for some questions and answers, so please get them ready for when we get to that stage. Thank you very much, and over to you, Joan. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. This is quite an interesting forum. So our session is entitled "How to Integrate Public Health Measures into Urban Investment to Support Job Creation and a Greener Recovery." That's a lot to cover. So I'm going to divide my comments into two areas. First, how to integrate public health measures into urban climate measures investments, and second, the urban investments to support job creation and a green recovery. Because I think as we're often framing this now, the idea that public health will create a greener recovery or a greener economy may or may not be the case. So if we can start the slides. Yes, move on. Next slide. Yes, so Greenovation came out on March 27th of 2020. And 3 days later, Oxford University Press's distribution center closed down. So the book was literally unavailable for months after it was published. And that phrase that I use, random acts of greenness, was trying to express the urgency of acting on climate change. And I thought that most cities weren't moving fast enough. And so what I do in the book is try to identify leading cities in Europe and North America in transportation, in electrification of transportation, in adopting renewables, in building efficiency, the various areas, and then examine how cities could get there that aren't there yet. But since then, of course, COVID hit, and how we look at climate has completely changed in the fact that we have to integrate public health into this. So the public health connection varies among countries, particularly looking at the global north and global south. And my work focuses on the global north. But if we look at the circumstance in the United States in terms of COVID, in terms of what we're addressing, many people, myself included, are arguing now that you can't talk about climate change without talking about climate justice. And again, that means different things in different countries. So if you could advance the slides. In the United States, climate justice, the need for climate justice centers around redlining. And in The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein reveals how this was intentional policy of the United States government. So redlining is a process that started in 1933 when our federal government raided neighborhoods for their loan programs for purchasing homes. And so working with real estate agencies, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is a federal agency, they created these color-coded maps that you see to inform the loan decisions of mortgage lenders at the Federal Housing Administration. So any neighborhood that had Black residents was colored red, which was considered the riskiest category, hence the term redlining. It's left a legacy of environmental pollution, which in turn has negative health impacts. So if we look at the dirtiest of industrial facilities in the United States, located in predominantly Black and immigrant neighborhoods, historically redlined neighborhoods have been deliberately exposed to sources of pollution such as highways, incinerators, factories, oil-fired plants, and more. And as a profession, urban planning was not just complicit, but active in these decisions. So the cumulative result is higher levels of polluting particulate matter in Black neighborhoods. In fact, the Union of Concerned Scientists estimates that African Americans and Latinos are exposed to about 40% more particulate matter from cars, trucks, and buses than whites. So if we look at what this means to health, one zip code in your mail code is a better predictor of one's health than one's genetic code. Researcher Melody Goodman, who's now at New York University, developed this city health dashboard that looked at life expectancy by neighborhood in US cities. And the gaps are as much as 30 years in Chicago. Washington, D.C. and New York City follow closely behind with a 27-year gap. So why is this important? Why am I talking about this now? Is because, of course, the COVID pandemic further exposed those gaps. So both the incident and death rates from COVID-19 were higher in low-income areas and communities of color, particularly if the housing was crowded. So it's the pollution, it's having to work that led to this, high levels of pollution and asthma. So those are the causes in the United States. Although the causes are different, we find the same patterns in cities throughout the world. And we're learning a lot about the factors leading to higher levels of transmission. Some early assumptions are proving false. Density in itself may not be as important as earlier thought. So really, it's aspects of urban form and function, connectedness, the uneven production of urban space, which results in differential access to transportation, to other public services, access to parks, urban green spaces. Those are all factors under investigation related to COVID. So if we can turn to the next slide. I am one of many authors on a chapter on COVID and climate change for the third climate assessment report for cities. In the process of thinking about what I've been writing and other people have been writing about how we need to integrate mitigation and adaptation, one of my co-authors and I developed this graphic to illustrate how public health can and must be integrated through public action. So if you look at this slide, or climate action rather, you see that equity is of concern underpinning all aspects of our climate work, mitigation and adaptation. And now we bring equity or health into the forefront. So then we look for those areas in the middle that would lead to better quality decisions. Can we advance a slide, please? So this is illegible, but it just gives you a sense. This looks at infrastructure, which we defined as energy, water, transportation, buildings, and communication, and try to find what are those sweet spots in the middle of that diagram that address mitigation, adaptation, and health in an equitable way. Can we move forward? Thank you. So the one I want to talk about in a little more detail today is urban heat island strategies, because I think we can see very easily with heat island strategies how they cross all three aspects of urban climate action. Next slide. So yesterday I moderated a panel that had the newly appointed Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston, Reverend Mariana White Hammond. And she spoke about the Healthy Places initiative, which illustrates how all three aspects of climate change can be integrated. So the first thing you have to do if you're talking about heat islands is to do a study and find out where the heat islands exist in the city. Notice that it also has an urban forest plan, because we know that so much of the urban heat island effect is a result of not having enough trees or green space in a community. But see, in this report, they're connecting it to building emissions performance standards, which is part of the mitigation strategy to reduce the energy used in buildings, and combining it with clean air and green jobs. Next slide. So here we see for Boston, the heat resilience study. And what this allows the city to do is at the neighborhood level to find out exactly where those heat islands exist. And then once that is discovered, you can prioritize which neighborhoods. Next slide. So what the city has done in this, decide to focus on these 5 neighborhoods. And part of the reason is their heat risk, obviously, but these are areas that, again, related to the redlining that I talked about, have been impacted by systemic racism, environmental injustice. And so it's because of this history that these are the most vulnerable. So the idea is then the climate plan should prioritize these neighborhoods first. And that's what has happened in Boston. So let me show you a little bit what that might look like in a particular neighborhood. Next slide. So this is the first Dorchester neighborhood, but a small area called the Talbot North Triangle, which has been designated as an eco-innovation district. What does that mean? Eco, the idea that it's ecological, to try to restore some of the green space of the neighborhood, but innovation, to use innovation to develop a comprehensive plan for this area. So what we see here is one aspect of it is tree planting. And the young men in the forefront had been in trouble with the courts before, and it's a program to engage them in their community in making improvements. So there's a workforce development connection to this as well. Next slide. And then what they have done as part of this is to look at different types of trees, what their impact is in terms of shading, the difficulty of growing them. And so this also is the eco part of this for the city and for the neighborhood to figure out exactly what are the kind of trees that will work in particular neighborhoods and kind of microclimates of a city. Next slide, please. So again, going to that analysis of urban heat islands, what this shows is areas that are under-treed, so to speak, so that you can focus not just let's plant 1 million trees, but let's plant those trees where they're going to have the most impact. Next slide, please. And here again, we see this, the red being the hot areas of the neighborhood that need trees. So a very methodical approach to addressing urban heat island as a health issue, as a mitigation issue, as an adaptation issue, and also through that creating jobs. Next slide. So here again, we see this is the Resilient Green Infrastructure and Workforce Development Program, where the first national certification program for green stormwater management in urban forestry has been developed with the Nature Conservancy and is now being implemented in this area. So this is, again, how all 3 elements can be connected in communities and also address equity issues as well. Next slide. Okay, so I said the talk is going to be in two different areas. I could give you all kinds of examples of small programs like this that cities have developed, and there's workforce development programs around them, building energy efficiency, all the things that need to be done in houses and offices to make those buildings more efficient. But if we're talking about a green transition and a Green New Deal type of recovery, these programs are not going to add up to that. And so we really have to think not just what we can do at the city level, but how can that connect to national policy, state policy, and work together to really make that green transition. Next slide. So last month, I published a cover story in the American Prospect that I want to talk a little bit about here. It was about, the article was called "The Case for Taking Back Solar." And so again, you think, I'm an urban planner. Why am I talking about solar as an industry? But it's really important. In the United States, solar is the cheapest form of electricity. It was stalled a little bit during the pandemic, but installations have been increasing dramatically in the United States. But 76% of our solar panels are from China. Now, does that matter? If you're a solar installer, no, you're taking the subsidies that are provided by cities, by states, by the national government, and doing quite well installing Chinese-made panels. I argue that matters a lot, and that we need to have, any country that's going solar needs to have somewhat of an industry. One of the things we found out in the COVID pandemic is that 95% of our pharmaceuticals are produced in China. We found out that just about all of our personal protection equipment is produced in China. So it's never good to be that dependent on one country for such key items. And I would argue solar fits in that category as well. Next slide, please. So in this article, I make the case for a solar industry based on national security concerns, ethical concerns having to do with forced labor, economic concerns in that there's a lot of good manufacturing jobs in solar, and environmental reasons as well. It doesn't make sense from a climate perspective to be importing solar panels that are produced without any environmental regulation with power that is produced from coal. So if we look at solar here, it's not just the panels themselves that we're talking about, it is the entire value chain of solar. So the red is Chinese production. For the first one is the polysilicon, the next is the ingots, the next is the wafers, the next is the solar cells, and the next is the solar modules. So again, as an urban planner, I think it matters if we're imposing city and state and eventually national policies that say we must convert to renewable energy, that we really pay attention to where that renewable energy comes from. So what are the solutions then, if in terms of making that green transition for any given country? Next slide, please. So if I look at what can a city do, can be solar mandates. We can say that by a certain period of time, the city utilities will produce or purchase energy that is renewable. The city can engage in power purchase agreements and purchase its own, under certain circumstances, renewable energy. We can promote community solar for people who can't afford, even with subsidies, to put solar on their roofs, to have community solar that many people can benefit from, even if they can't have it on their rooftop. Cities, just like we saw the heat mapping, can do solar mapping so that they know solar panels are being applied in a way that's the most efficient, and workforce development in who gets trained for these jobs. At the national level, we have trade policy. The World Trade Organization agreements do not discriminate among trading partners. They agree to treat imported and locally produced goods equally. There have been many fights going on over subsidies and putting tariffs on solar panels, and actually they've worked somewhat. The more important thing going on in the Biden administration right now is purchasing. And cities, states, federal governments can prioritize domestically produced a solar panel. You can give manufacturing tax credits to help jumpstart the industry that exists in any given country. And of course, workforce development at all levels. and then research and development. So that kind of looks at what that connection is between different levels of policy in order to have a green transition or a Green New Deal, however you want to call it. And my time is about up here. I could give many examples, and I know someone's going to be talking after me about London, but in the book, one of the things I talk about is that strategy in London to promote electric vehicles. And it focuses on where the charging stations are going to be, how to charge. But the biggest component of it is electrification of buses, but also the electrification of all the taxis in London. How did that happen? Well, Geely, a Chinese manufacturer, bought London Taxi, and then the city mandated that they would all convert to electric. And Geely actually renovated a manufacturing facility so that they're being produced in the UK. Similarly, Los Angeles is the first city in the United States that's very rapidly converting all of its buses to electric. And working with an organization called Jobs to Move America, with city government, with state government, negotiated BYD, Build Your Dreams, a Chinese manufacturer, if it wanted the contract, would build those buses in the United States, which is also jump-starting a competitor, a US-based electric bus producer. So again, it's a combination of city policy, national policy, and state policy that can really build a new green recovery. Thank you.
Some questions and answer session now. So I see a few questions coming up in the chat. Maybe I can share some of them with you and see how you can come back on some of them. We have participants from a range of countries, which you may or may not be familiar with, but let's give it a go. So we have Jonas is asking, he's working in Nepal, and solar is typically more for household and office level, and they rely a lot more on hydropower. So wondered whether you had any observations on that. And again, another question is, applying perhaps solar in mountainous and hilly regions, the difficulties are around that. I guess, thinking through the difference between rooftop solar or ground-based solar type interventions. So I would put those to you first. Quite a lot of interest on rapidly developing solar in Kenya, and looking at options as well beyond solar to wind power and geothermal as well. Yeah, so maybe let's go on this sort of various renewable energy options for cities. Thanks.
Sure. Well, hydropower is the dominant form of clean energy. And of course, there's controversies about that in terms of what damming does and the environmental harm. But I think in the United States and most countries, if they add up their renewable category, the largest part of that is hydro. So of course, it's an important part of that. In terms of where solar can be built, it's a very good question. I mean, we subsidize, I think, indiscriminately in many cases, renewable energy. So there's a group out of Stanford University that has done a study for every state in many countries of what the ideal mix of renewables would be. And it looks at wind, offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, geothermal, and so forth. And if we look at Massachusetts, offshore wind should be the biggest source of our power. We're just getting started on that. And so everyone wants to make that conversion fast. So we're investing a lot in solar. And it might not be the most efficient long-term thing to be investing in. So I think there's often mismatch between, which is the ideal source of power. We have district heating and cooling, and there's a very exciting possibility in Boston that will be increased dramatically and taken off of fossil fuels. We're seeing district energy with geothermal. So absolutely, every country, every city, every state has to look at what mix is best and then where to put it. So you're right in the comment about rooftop solar not being ideal everywhere. And so we have these huge solar farms. But there's lots of conflicts associated with this. So there's environmental conflicts. So if we're in California, you could put huge arrays in the Mojave Desert, but it will interrupt the patterns of various animals, a tortoise that live there. And so that's in debate. You will need a lot of electricity transmission. Where do those wires go? That's a source of conflict. You have solar farms being developed in one part of the state where the energy goes to the other, and the people say, why are we ruining our environment? Similarly with offshore wind, there's all kinds of conflicts around tourism industry, the fishing industry. So I think no matter which renewable source we are looking at, there's always going to be conflicts, and these conflicts are going to slow down the transition to renewable energy. I'm just looking through the questions.
Hi, if you can hear me, maybe I can add a question. I think many of them were about the renewable energy types, but I wondered, because we have a number of cities here who are starting this journey, and you mentioned the case of the urban heat island and doing some initial analytics to understand where are the under-treed areas, perhaps where are the heat issues. I wonder if you had any recommendations or advice to some of our participants who are starting this journey, how to go about starting the analytics and thinking about the challenges and the ways that these mitigation and adaptation issues can be managed in cities. Thanks.
Yeah, the urban heat island one, I think, is, again, looking at that Venn diagram, the issue that crosses health mitigation and adaptation. And the most important first step is to do that mapping, to figure out where the heat islands are so that you can concentrate your strategies effectively. And for the most part, what cities find is they're in the poorest neighborhoods, right? Because they don't have the parks and green spaces generally. And so that's the first step, is just to figure out where you need to prioritize action. I think another important aspect of it is to look for ways to do more than one thing. So it's not just about green space as a park, but how can you use those green spaces for natural stormwater management rather than combined water sewer type systems. And so if you're building new green space, that green space should be stormwater management space as well. And then I think, one of the things we see in many cities is that there's a lot of trees planted, but a lot of them don't do very well. And so to really do the research on what kind of trees, what do they provide mostly, what kind of water demands they have. Because one of the things we don't think about is, obviously, urban heat islands, we want to address heat, and it's in hot places. Trees require a lot of water. So the trees can provide a canopy, but they're also going to increase water demands. And watering the trees and keeping care of them is really an essential part. So it's a comprehensive planning process to do it effectively. And so engaging people in communities is also important, because they're going to be the ones that will help in taking care of those trees. and making sure that they live.
And maybe coming back to that, because the topic of this technical deep dive is metropolitan regions, where often you might have more than one city, town, or village, which requires collaboration across administrative boundaries. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on scaling up collaboration, beyond the administrative boundaries, and what that requires, or some examples perhaps of that for our participants.
Yeah, that's a very difficult problem to address, in that, when we look at environments, we're talking about, seashores that don't stop at a city boundary. We're talking about watersheds, and those don't correspond with political boundaries. So many places have metropolitan planning districts, few give them power. So I think one of the things that I'm seeing, at least in the Boston area and others, is planning groups around particular waterways. So when we have the Boston Harbor Commission, all of the cities that are on the harbor are affected by its actions. Similarly, a watershed, the Mystic River Watershed Association, just put out a report then that will inform the policies of all the cities in that watershed. And so I think the NGO sector that takes these particular, a watershed association, a harbor association, a forest association, and does the analysis at the metropolitan, or not really the metropolitan, the watershed, and then inform city governments so that they can coordinate. It's very difficult because everyone has to be on board, and that's not always the case. So I don't have an easy answer to that one.
Thank you, Joan. And I don't know if you have any sort of final closing thoughts for our participants as they plan their own metro region climate action, green recovery process. I'm sure they would like to hear any final words from you before we close this session. Thanks.
Well, I think what I would say is, everyone talks about doing a greenhouse gas inventory, because if you don't measure it, you don't know whether you're improving on it. And that's in fact a requirement of many of the international city organizations. But even without that, for every city, the biggest source of emissions is transportation and buildings. So those are where the effort needs to go, as well as energy that's used in those buildings. So I think focusing on those aspects on the mitigation side are essential. But then again, looking at adaptation, the thing that I would say is that the more things where you can do double duty, the better. And so if you look at that Venn diagram I showed at the beginning, if you look at, oftentimes, cities will divide up. There's one group that's looking at adaptation, one group that's looking at mitigation. And then when you talk about health, that's a totally different department. And so it really requires cities to think a little differently, instead of, siloed departments, to integrate that planning process around climate and think of ways that you can do more than one thing, more than one benefit with one action, will help facilitate moving quicker and having more impact.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Joan, for your time today and sharing your research and your advice. We're very happy to have you, and we look forward to hearing from you again in future events. Wish you a good day, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And welcome to stay on and listen. We have a great session coming up now. So we will be moving from North America to London. And we have Daniel Bicknell from London City Hall. And he will be talking about the London Recovery Programme and the Green New Deal mission there. Hi, Daniel. And Daniel is a chartered environmental specialist leading on climate change adaptation for the Mayor of London. And he has over 15 years of experience working on climate change, resilience, as well as water policy. for international organizations, governments, and cities like London. So we're really happy to have you here, Daniel. And I think over to you to hear about London's recovery program. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And just bear with me a moment whilst I share my screen with you.
No problem.
Would you just be able to confirm that you can see the presentation?
Something is moving, so it looks good. Yes, we can see. Thanks a lot,
Excellent.
Daniel.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Lovely to be here, and thank you for asking London to be part of this workshop. I caught the tail end of what Joan was talking about in her presentation, and I found myself nodding away profusely at many of the things she was saying, because a lot of the things that Joan picked up on there, particularly around sort of integration and joining the different elements and stakeholder engagement, are kind of key priorities for us in making sure that we deliver a Green New Deal for London. So as I say, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me along today. Just to say a little bit about myself, beyond the bio that you just heard. So I lead at City Hall on climate adaptation. So focusing primarily on the climate-related impacts that we're already starting to experience. And pertinently, today, the Committee on Climate Change in the UK just released a new adaptation report for the whole of the UK, but with some really powerful points around the importance of adaptation. And something that I feel and experience in my role quite often is, because of this very, very strong drive essential drive towards zero carbon now for 2030 in London's case, adaptation can take a back seat, and we have to try really, really hard to make sure that we are implementing both mitigation and adaptation measures in parallel and at the earliest possible opportunity. So coming on to the Green New Deal mission in a bit more detail, then since the onset of the pandemic, the Mayor of London has been very clear actually about tackling the climate emergency and making progress on goals around zero carbon and achieving a zero carbon city that is also resilient to the impacts of climate change. This is compatible with a prosperous recovery from COVID. In fact, London's recovery from the pandemic really does need to lead to a cleaner, fairer and more equal city with a renewed drive to tackle the climate emergency and create good quality jobs as part of that process as well. And to achieve this mission, the Mayor has worked with other politicians in London to convene the London Recovery Board, jointly with another organisation called London Councils. And Joan in her presentation talked a bit about some of the challenges around administrative boundaries. London's makeup is quite complex. The Mayor of London is very high profile as a figure, but has actually very limited powers. And quite small budgets compared to some other major metropolises around the world. London comprises 33 separate local authority areas, each with their own local government administrations and departments that cover all the different sectors you might imagine of City Hall. So coordination and convening becomes a really important part of the Mayor's role, and developing strategic policies that cut across London's 33 different administrations is kind of critically important and central to London's role. And the Recovery Board is made up of constituent members that reflects this kind of administrative diversity of the capital, and really emphasises the need for collaboration, both at the London scale, but also at national and international level. So coming on some of the sort of net zero commitments that London has, the Mayor is committed to making London a net zero carbon city by 2030, as I said. We've got a 1.5 degree climate action plan, which is compatible with the highest ambitions of the Paris Agreement. We need to reduce and manage energy demand and decarbonise our energy and transportation systems critically, whilst also creating a more resilient city that's adapted to the impacts of climate change. And as I say, doing this in parallel is essential. We've already started by creating the world's first ultra-low emission zone in the capital, bringing down air pollution, retrofitting public buildings and social housing, alleviating fuel poverty, building district heating networks, creating more cycling and walking routes, promoting nature-based solutions, for example, sustainable drainage systems to manage stormwater flows, and emphasizing the need and creating policies to promote greater green infrastructure use to manage the climate risks in the city. And we're also working on the economic and investment side, pushing for divesting of pension funds to move them away from investments in fossil fuels. So just coming on to the program itself and how it's structured, the program has one grand challenge, which is around restoring confidence in the city, minimizing the impact on London's communities and building back better the city's economy and society. And the structure for this is around 9 missions and shaped by three key dimensions. So the key outcomes are around reversing the patterns of unemployment. London's been particularly hard hit by the pandemic and job losses, partly due to the sort of culture sector and the tourism sector, and also the sort of gig economy in London. It's also about supporting our communities, including those most impacted by the virus. It's about narrowing social and economic health inequalities, accelerating delivery of a cleaner, greener London, and helping young people flourish. And then underlying or cutting across those principles, we have some cost-cutting principles that need to be considered in all of the missions. And it's around tackling inequalities, ensuring sustainability is built into all of the policies and programs that come out of the recovery program. Collaborating and involving London's diverse communities, so around engagement, improving the health and well-being of Londoners, innovating and using digital technology and data to meet emerging needs, and also ensuring affordability of the measures and providing value for money. So here are some of the London Recovery Board missions that I mentioned. There are 9 of them, and they focus on issues from high street revival and good work through to engaging youth, social cohesion, and the one that I'm most significantly involved in is the Green New Deal, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail. So the Green New Deal mission will drive London's recovery by tackling the climate and ecological emergencies in tandem. It'll improve air quality whilst also aiming to double the size of London's green economy by 2030 and accelerating job creation for all. The Mayor has already committed 10 million through its Green New Deal fund to projects this financial year and will commit a further 12 million over the next 2 years of the 3-year programme. I should say the Mayor was recently re-elected, and because of the pandemic, the elections were pushed back a year. So the Mayor has now a tighter 3-year electoral term to deliver some of these, to deliver the Green New Deal and the other missions as part of the London Recovery Board. And he's very much determined that it's all about delivery over these next 3 years. So London's low carbon and environmental goods and services sector are worth around 48 billion in sales and employ around 317,000 people at the moment. So we've got a really good base to start work from through this programme. And green activity in London is not just about creating jobs, it's also about creating jobs in the supply chain and value chains across the UK. London is significantly the largest city in the UK by a huge margin and delivers a lot of the country's wealth. The government is often focused on the levelling up agenda and ensuring other regions are able to sort of catch up with London. And I think a key point that the Mayor is trying to reiterate at the moment is these interventions and programmes that we're delivering in London to deliver a Green New Deal power supply chains in the rest of the country. You know, the bus electrification programme in London, the buses are produced elsewhere, the parts of the buses are produced elsewhere in the UK. So, you know, investment of this sort in London is investment in other parts of the country as well, which is an important point that we and the Mayor frequently make. So just in terms of the Green New Deal programme itself, it's split around 3 key themes to deliver the projects around decarbonising and transforming the built environment. The second strand is around greening London's transport and public realm. And the third is around mobilising new finance and supporting green jobs and skills and lifestyles. So just to say a little bit more about the programmes that underlie all those. So under the built environment, it's very much about retrofitting. It's about the zero carbon pathway, community energy schemes, decarbonising energy and waste and recycling systems. And the public realm is, I mean, this is very much in recognition of the health and well-being benefits that really came to the fore during the pandemic in London and in many other cities as well. You know, people really learned to value the benefits of their green spaces, and you know, we've come to recognise and now done some work to, you know, identify where new green spaces are needed to ensure a more equitable distribution of green space across the capital, you know, to ensure that people really have these spaces on their doorsteps. It's probably worth saying part of the mayor's re-election mandate was, and it's in his manifesto, is around creating the 10-minute city when it comes to green space. So he wants every Londoner to be within a 10-minute walk of a green space. And London is not doing badly. It starts from a strong base. It's a national park city, designated as such a couple of years ago, and is nearly 50% green. But nevertheless, there are communities and pockets. And as mentioned previously, actually in the last presentation, many of the poor areas of London are the ones that have significant difficulties in terms of access to green space. And then the final strand is around green foundations. So that's putting long-term financing in place and empowering Londoners to make sustainable choices, building the low carbon and circular economy sectors, pushing small and medium enterprises and businesses and charities to grow that section of the sector. But it's also about using some of the powers that the mayor does have around lobbying to lobby for change and devolving powers where possible to the mayor to ensure that these objectives are delivered. So I'm just going to focus in on a couple of the areas under each of the three themes I mentioned first, starting with the built environment section. So starting with the mayoral retrofit programs, it's very much about, you know, ensuring London's building stock. You know, the majority of London is already in place. New development in London only accounts for about 1% of London's land area each year, which means we have a lot of existing building stock that isn't fit for purpose, and a lot to do in terms of, you know, increasing energy efficiency and adapting those buildings to a changing climate. So the mayor has declared a retrofit revolution with a package of measures to create ultra low carbon buildings and tackle the climate emergency and create green jobs. As part of this retrofitting process, there's lots of potential for growing the green job sector through growing the retrofitting of buildings. And all of this will be in support of the ambitious zero carbon 2030 target. So to zoom in on a couple of the programs, the mayor has his Retrofit Accelerator Homes program, which is supporting over 1,600 whole house retrofits in London's ageing and energy and efficient social housing stock to create warm, affordable and ultra low carbon homes. He has an equivalent Retrofit Accelerator for Workplaces, which is an award-winning program helping to make London's non-domestic public buildings and assets more energy efficient, lowering carbon emissions and saving public money. So far, it's improved over 300 public sector buildings, saving over 13,000 tonnes of carbon and 36 megawatts of energy each year. This year, it helped secure over 190 million funding for from the public sector decarbonisation scheme for 17 public sector organisations. And then recently, the mayor launched a new 6 million local energy accelerator programme, which is supporting public sector and the private sector organisations in London to develop low carbon, locally generated district energy networks. Projects include using renewable heat and energy technologies such as heat pumps, solar panels, batteries, and smart electric vehicle charging schemes and infrastructure. We also have the London Community Energy Fund, which will support community energy projects such as solar panels on schools and community centres and electric vehicle charging points throughout the capital, which, as we know, is essential to enabling and growing the electric vehicle market and making it feasible in the city. We have the Solar Together programme supporting the group buying model to unlock significant savings from suppliers, so up to 35% in previous rounds of the Solar Together scheme, to make solar more affordable for Londoners, and include support for installers to boost their training and employment opportunities and grow and strengthen the supply chain, as I said, both in London, but also outside London as well. And then we have the Solar Skills London programme, which is a skills and training programme to enable Londoners to learn more about solar technologies and help create more green jobs. Training and apprenticeships will focus on battery storage, electric vehicle charging and related smart technologies. The programme will also include a placement programme to get trainees into solar businesses and targeted grant schemes to deliver quality training to staff at 100 solar installation companies in London. And then finally, we've got the Old Oak and Park Royal Solar PV programme. So the Old Oak and Park Royal is where London is building one of its new high-speed rail stations. It's going to see 250,000 passenger movements each year. As a result of this, as a catalyst for growth, the mayor has declared it a mayoral growth area and created a mayoral development corporation, which encompasses the area. It includes an existing large-scale industrial estate, but also space for 25,000 new homes for Londoners. And as part of this programme, given that there's lots of existing industrial buildings, lots of large flat roofs, not particularly high-rise in any location, it has huge solar potential. So we're working with the Mayoral Development Corporation at Old Oak to roll out a solar PV retrofit program on non-domestic buildings with view to creating a model that's suitable for scale up elsewhere in the capital and beyond. So that's a sort of quick summary of the built environment strand of the Green New Deal. Moving on to transport and public realm, and this is where a lot of sort of my work personally sits around using green infrastructure to ensure climate adaptation measures are installed is part of sort of active travel interventions, so cycling and walking routes, but also creating new and existing green spaces and looking at how we can use nature-based solutions such as sustainable drainage to help manage the growing impacts of climate change in London. So the first programme probably worth touching on is the Green and Resilient Spaces programme and the Combined Green and Healthy Streets programme. They're two programmes with quite significant budgets associated with them to be delivered over the next 3 years. And they're looking at their grants programmes going out to the 33 boroughs and other organisations in London that are in a position to deliver sustainable drainage and green infrastructure schemes and parks and green spaces improvements across the capital. What we're doing, and I'll come on to say a little bit about this later in the presentation around how we use sort of data and various different urban tools and models to inform our decision making. But what we're doing is we're prioritising where these interventions and funding goes based on areas of greatest need. So we're looking at things like areas of deficiency and access to green space. We're also looking at things like climate vulnerability and spatial variability and climate risk. So the program's broadly split into upgrading and improving existing green spaces and creating new green spaces and greening the public realm on the one hand. And the second part of the programme is slightly broader, and it's working with the Mayor's Transport Authority called Transport for London to identify and make permanent some of the schemes that were implemented during the pandemic. London very quickly implemented a series of street space schemes as soon as the pandemic came about. The driver for this was to allow for better social distancing. So in a nutshell, what it did was it squeezed street space and made a greater amount of space for cycling and walking through creating temporary new cycling and walking routes. What we're now doing through this programme is looking at funding a lot of those temporary schemes and identifying where they could be made into permanent schemes through engineering in new green infrastructure, cycling routes, sustainable drainage systems that deliver a series of co-benefits around greening the public realm. And then the final programme here, which is a second round programme, we've already done one round of Grow Back Greener grants. These are more community focused, smaller schemes, again aimed at delivering public realm and green space greening in the city and also delivering urban climate resilience measures. So things like cool spaces, cooling and shading measures, and again, drainage and water reuse measures as well, but more aimed at sort of community groups and the smaller types of intervention. So the photo you see there is an example of one of the Grow Back Greener grant schemes being delivered with community involvement, which is also an important part of these programs. Also, under the transport and public realm section, we've launched a new, quite high-profile program called the Future Neighbourhoods Programme, which the Mayor launched in March. It supports, or it's going to support, 2 to 4 London neighbourhoods to transform their local environments, tackling London's sort of defining environmental challenges, which includes the climate emergency and air quality, but also creating jobs and developing skills and supporting a just transition to a low carbon and more circular economy. So we're going through a sort of shortlisting process at the moment to select which of these future neighbourhoods will come forward as front runners in which London boroughs. And again, they need to meet criteria around, tackling some of the most significant environmental challenges in London. And what we hope will be, cross-cutting exemplar neighbourhoods that cut right across the kind of environmental agenda, from, implementing low carbon technologies to sort of exemplar, scalable and replicable public realm interventions that help us adapt to climate change and help us transition to low carbon forms of transport and moving around the city. Another scheme which I touched on a moment ago is around bus electrification. We're investing in the design and delivery of power infrastructure for bus garages in London, which will allow us to drastically increase the number of electric buses that currently move around London. So we're aiming to enable the transformation of London's 9,000 buses into a zero tailpipe emissions fleet. And then this isn't by any means all of the programs. These are just the ones I wanted to highlight, but we've also just launched a Cool Spaces program, loosely modeled on other Cool Spaces programs elsewhere in the world. Paris has one, New York has one, and actually we worked with Bloomberg Associates out of New York to develop our Cool Spaces program. Essentially what it does is identify parks with suitable characteristics to create cool spaces, and then it provides the information and communications around what services are at those cool spaces and how to reach them. And we also, for the first time, have launched indoor cool spaces as well. Or in fact, I say that we've launched them. We're about to launch them on the 21st of June. However, we may have to delay the launch by 4 weeks, as London has just the government of the UK has just delayed the easing of COVID restrictions, which were due to happen on the 21st of June, by 4 weeks. So we anticipate that the opening of indoor cool spaces will also be set back 4 weeks. But in a nutshell, that's about providing ordinary Londoners a place to go and cool off if their homes are too warm, or they get too warm when transitioning from their workplace to where they live. And then finally, around the Green New Deal, the third theme is around green foundations. This is so a couple of the areas of work we're sort of taking forward here around unlocking green finances. The estimated capital cost of decarbonising London's built environment and infrastructure is estimated at 61 billion. A major investment opportunity through green finance that will also deliver enormous social and environmental benefits. But to do this, the public and the private sector partners need to share both the risk and the return in this process. So we're taking a threefold approach around this. Through direct investment through mayoral programs. So the Mayor's Accelerator programs I mentioned a few slides earlier create a pipeline of investable climate-related projects, and the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund provides low-cost capital for those. The Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund is a £500 million fund that was capitalised with 86 million of public sector funding to attract over 400 million of private sector finance as match funding. The second part is around enabling investment. So Mayor's working with a Green Finance Institute in the UK to identify how we can create a step change in both the size of the project pipeline and also the scale of the private sector finance flowing into them. This will support investment in retrofitting and decarbonising energy supply to zero emissions vehicles and also nature-based solutions as well, which we're urgently promoting and moving to at the moment. And then finally, of those three areas, we're also championing divestment. We're encouraging systemic changes to the investment policy by London's institutional investors, such as London's pension funds, by championing the divestment of funds from fossil fuels and into climate and green investment. So one of the groups we're working with is London's public sector pension funds, who have huge pension funds, and we're successfully driving down the proportion of their investments that are linked to fossil fuel activities. We're also working both nationally and internationally to promote divestment. In London, the Mayor issued a call to action in London, encouraging London boroughs to divest, and already 13 of those London boroughs are taking action on this. And we also work at the international level, with the Mayor working with the Mayor of New York. They collectively launched the C40 Divest Invest Forum to share experience and encourage action, and currently 15 cities have joined as members of this. A couple of other areas outside of the investment envelope. Advanced London is a programme that's supporting small and medium enterprises to transition to more circular business models and scale up the circular economy. And then the Better Futures programme, which is tailored support to small and medium enterprises to improve the success rate of startups and the speed that low carbon enterprises are able to support London's transition. It'll provide tailored business and technical development support with a proactive focus on underrepresented groups, but also particularly women in the clean tech sector. So that sort of kind of finalizes what I was going to say on the specifics of the Green New Deal, but I wanted to touch briefly on some of the tools that we're using to support our investment decisions in the city. And what you see here is one of our sort of key investment decision support tools in terms of where we spatially want to target interventions, particularly interventions in the public realm. So what we've produced is a series of climate risk and vulnerability maps. What it does is it takes a series of vulnerability metrics around, socioeconomic characteristics of Londoners that we have from, government data, city data, demographic data, and so on and so forth. And it overlays that with exposure metrics, so things like the surface water flood risk, urban heat island impacts, and those sort of things. And it gives you a composite map, giving you a heat map of climate risk scores, if you like. So red being areas of highest climate risk. And then what we're doing this is we're feeding this data into, for example, the grants programs I mentioned previously, but also where we're targeting direct investment and where we're designing projects and programs to say, look, we recognize that the impacts of climate change, as in the impacts of COVID and the pandemic, are not distributed equally. They impact on some of the poor and more vulnerable communities disproportionately, and therefore we should be targeting our investment in London, given that it's limited, to the places that need it most. And as a strategic authority with oversight over 33 boroughs, we're in a position to use data looking right across London to target our interventions and justify investing in certain locations more than others, if you like. So this is a really important tool for us. There are other data sets as well linked to green infrastructure. I touched on those a moment ago. We have specific data around areas of deficiency and access to green space. That is actually one of the constituent layers of the climate vulnerability mapping as well, but it's also useful to understand specifically which areas have a deficiency in access to green space. So, for example, what areas have more than a 10-minute walk to a decent park, and therefore similarly prioritizing our interventions in that way. And then I won't go into too much detail on this, but to suffice to say, London has I haven't really talked too much about London's climate challenges, but it has all of the climate challenges you might expect from a large metropolis. There is significant flood risk, tidal flood risk, albeit relatively well defended. Fluvial flood risk from rivers, again, reasonably well defended. Surface water flood risk from storm water flows, also a significant risk. Over 160,000 London properties at medium or high risk of surface water flooding. Very little in the way of defences to protect London against those. And so, like many other cities, we're embarking on an aim to make as much of London green and as much of London drained through green, nature-based, sustainable drainage systems as possible. So what we're doing is we've created a series of tools that help inform where sustainable drainage is best located, and this here is one of those kind of urban modelling tools. What it does is it takes hydrological flood data, essentially a flood model, and overlays it with investment information around the natural capital benefits of SUDs. And what it does is it makes a case for putting sustainable drainage measures in certain places over other locations within the street. So what this data allows us to do is say, well, what I should say is one of the challenges we have in London is attracting national flood risk funding for small sustainable drainage schemes. Typically, national funding is allocated on a cost benefit basis, and the funding tends to go to large flood risk management schemes that have huge cost benefit based on protecting large numbers of properties from flooding. With small sustainable drainage schemes, it's really difficult to demonstrate a benefit of one small scheme protecting, other properties in the same drainage catchment. So what this work does is calculates the aggregated benefits of lots of different sustainable drainage schemes across the capital and creates a cost benefit ratio based on that. So it tells us that we could, if you put sustainable drainage on that corner, and on that street over there, 2 streets down, that gives you a far greater bang for your buck in terms of surface water flood risk benefit than just putting them randomly at any given location. So we've calculated that if we implement sustainable drainage in the top 5% locations across London, it gives us 60% of the drainage benefit. And that's not to mention the natural capital benefits of providing nature-based greenery in the public realm as well, which delivers a whole series of co-benefits around, air quality, cooling, and so on and so forth. So it makes a really strong case now for us to attract national flood risk funding to small sustainable drainage schemes. So this is a big step forward. And just in terms of what you're looking at there, you can see we've created a heat map of where the best locations are for locating SUDs, essentially.
Dan, if I could just maybe come in at this point, if you could just wrap up. We have a couple of questions and a couple of minutes left.
Sure, that's fine. I'm pretty much at the end of my slides. I was just going to talk you through some of the sustainable drainage schemes, but I won't do that in any detail. I think many of you in your cities will be familiar with the sustainable drainage schemes that we're looking to implement across London. So probably what I'll do then is I'll probably just finish by really sort of saying that the programs that we're looking to deliver on the back of the pandemic are really about sort of both tackling the climate emergency, but also helping London recover economically in a more sort of equitable way and ensuring a just transition to a low carbon economy, making sure we bring everyone with us on this journey with new infrastructure and new ways of moving around the capital. But it's also critically about ensuring London becomes more resilient to the impacts that we're already experiencing of climate change, and really to put London in a better position to tackle any future pandemics and the impacts of climate change as they worsen through times. But yeah, I think I'll finish there and happy to take questions.
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. I mean, it's amazing to see, as Joan had mentioned, it's going beyond random acts of greenness and developing a metropolitan region strategy, but also on the institutional side, having this recovery board that goes across the 33 local administrations. But if I could maybe just ask a couple of the very interesting questions from our participants. So the first one, you had mentioned, I think, 10 million pounds, I guess, for the recovery program. But obviously, this is part of a broader financing strategy because, the many initiatives that you mentioned, maybe if you could just touch on that. And then I think you already covered the issue on inclusion and affordability that was also asked, so I won't go into that. But maybe you could say something about how this effort to be more resilient prepares London for other unexpected like the pandemic. If you touch on that, I'll just leave it with those 2 questions and then leave it to you to finish up. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm really sorry, but you actually broke up just as you were talking about your point on climate resilience at the end. Could you just repeat that?
Okay, sorry. Yes, it's whether you feel that being more prepared for climate resilience helps you be prepared for other types of disasters or crises like the pandemic.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it's something that was really highlighted by, and it's not unique to London by any stretch, but it's probably more about the communities that are most impacted by things like a global pandemic are also least resilient to the other shocks, including the shocks that we expect to see as a result of the climate impacts being implemented. So I mean, I think I've probably touched on why targeting sort of high climate risk and vulnerable communities is a priority for us. And it's around the inequitable distribution of sort of green space and the reliability of infrastructure, and people's own agency to be able to respond as well to climate impacts in the city, which gives us quite a clear mandate to ensure that we're targeting our interventions in the areas that really need it most. And it does and will extend beyond the Green New Deal program. It cuts across all of the other missions as part of the London Recovery Board about ensuring that those communities that I mentioned are first to access the skills and training needs that come about as a result of these projects and programs that we're launching in London. But it also goes to questions around sort of how resilient London's infrastructure is, and when London's water companies sort of respond to some of the problems presented by climate change, that they do so in a way that ensures it considers and tackles vulnerable Londoners and vulnerable communities first, if you like.
Thank you, Dan. I
yeah.
think we need to wrap it there because we have another session starting, and I know the speakers are waiting, but I wanted to thank you very much. I'm sure there will be a lot of interest from our participants to have your presentation and to follow up and hear more from London. So thank you very much for today.
Thanks. Happy to connect. Yeah.
Great. All right. So I will hand over to Victor, who will be introducing the next session and the next speakers. Thanks again, Daniel.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you to our speakers, Professor Joan and Daniel. These were very inspiring and thought-provoking sessions to start the day, and they gave us a very good perspective of the new ideas of how to build back better and greener with a practical example and framework of the Green New Deal of London. We now move to our next session that takes us from London to Tokyo. This session will be conducted in Japanese, and I will be presenting the case of Futako Tamagawa neighborhood. The session will be moderated by my colleague Haruka Mikimoto. Haruka is operational specialist at the World Bank, and she leads the operational support program at the Tokyo Development Learning Center. Haruka, welcome to this event. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you so much again, Joanna and Dan. That was a fantastic session. I wanted to hear more. I'm sure we would have had a lot of questions. So I'm very glad to moderate the next session. So this is the session titled Building Green Sustainable Peri-Urban Neighborhood at the Gates from Futako Tamagawa. Very excited to welcome two exciting speakers with us today. So Mr. Masafumi Ota, he is a senior researcher at Tokyo Research Institute. He has taken various positions at Tokyo Corporation and its think tank institutions. He specializes in TOD or transit-oriented development. He leads numerous urban regeneration projects in Tokyo and in Japan. Mr. Oda holds PhD from the Bartlett School of Planning at University College London and the Master of Engineering at the University of Tokyo. Welcome, Oda-san. And we also have Mr. Hidetoshi Tamaoka. He is Executive Project Manager at Pacific Consultants, or PCKK. He is currently responsible for business promotion and management of urban development projects for overseas clients. He's very experienced in project management and number planning, TOD engineering, with over 27 years of experience. So welcome, Tamaoka-san, as well. Before diving into this session, some housekeeping announcement. This session from now on will be presented in Japanese, and we will be interpreting. So I will now explain about how to connect to the Hopin translation for those people who are still learning Japanese. Please follow these steps as I explain. Okay, so studio, can we share the PowerPoint slide for this if there's any? Thank you. So step 1, on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see the Stage tab. Under the Stage tab, please click the Translation tab. Step 2, please select English in the drop-down menu. Step 3, please click Connect. And finally, step 4, once you are connected to translation, please make sure to lower the stage audio because otherwise you will be keep listening both English and Japanese and it's going to interfere your volume. Don't forget to adjust the volume back once to the original audio level after this session. Are we all set? Are we ready? Okay. So,ここからは日本語と英語の同時通訳で進めさせていただきます。改めまして、太田さん、また玉岡さん。
太田さん、玉岡さん、thank you very much for your participation. At the very beginning, we talked about the post-COVID and how we can deal with the climate change, and also what kind of risks we need to think about in the vulnerable communities. And the second session was focusing on London, City of London, and what kind of new Green Deal recovery activities are being carried out. And in Japan, we are going to focus more on the green and the peri-urban area redevelopment in the city called Futako, Tamagawa. And before we ask Mr. Ota to make a presentation, I'd like to play out the video of Futako Tamagawa redevelopment project.
This is a mixed-use TOD around Futako Tamagawa Station, one of the major suburban stations on the Tokyu-Dan Toshi Line, which has Shibuya Station as its terminal. This project has become an advanced example of new urban development in a suburban area, with close proximity between one's home and work. The establishment of business offices in the suburbs is well suited to the COVID-19 pandemic era.
それでは本日
よろしくお願いいたします。
今ほど私も双子玉川ライズ歩かせていただいたんですけれども、双子玉川ライズの特徴を一言で言っていただくとどういうことになりますでしょうか。
TOD 公共志向型の開発ということで、いわゆるグリーンシティを標榜した複合都市というところが最大の特徴かなというふうに思います。このエリアでやはりその生活の質の向上というものを目指して食住近接というものをスローガンにしながら日本一に働きたい街というものを目指して街づくりをしてまいりましたので、それがようやく体現できたかなというふうに考えております。
私も歩かせていただいて生活している方がいろいろ歩いていてですね、働いている方もいらっしゃって非常に生活して暮らすのにいい場所だなと思って見させていただきました。
東急田園都市線双子玉川駅を挟んで西側と東側と大きくエリアが分かれておりまして、東側エリアというのは非常に開発が遅れておりまして、道路が非常に狭かったりだとか防災上の問題もございましたので、1982年に再開発を考える会というものが発足し、水と緑と光というものをコンセプトにしながらこの再開発というものを地元とともに進めてきたという。東京の都心エリアから少し離れて、ただ一方で完全な郊外ではないという都心と郊外のこの中間地点としての準都心エリアとしての複合都市というものを作っていきたいという考えがございまして、地元の拠点、生活の拠点となるような場所づくりというものを進めてきたというところです。さらに昔はですね、多摩川の船渡しがあったりだとか、都心のレクリエーションのエリアということで非常に実は栄えていたんですね。そういった場所性も継承しながら業務というものを新たな要素として加えて複合都市として成熟をさせるという意味合いで、これまでの文脈にいろんな要素を組み合わせながら街を作っていくというところで、都市の田園地域、都市田園というものを目指していきたいなというイメージを持っておりました。
双子玉川ライズの開発というのはですね、昨今のやっぱり気候変動に対応したまちづくりをしていくというふうな考え方がかなり反映されているんじゃないかなというふうに思っているんですけれども、環境配慮とかですね、そういう面でどういう姿を目指されていたのかっていうのを教えていただけるとありがたいんですけれども。
双子玉川ライズは多摩川に隣接していたりですとか、近隣に国分寺外線というですね大きな緑地があるということも踏まえまして、臨地に区立公園を配置したりですとか、屋上庭園やビオトープを配置したりですとか、あとまた施設の配置もですね風の通るような配置にするといったことで、環境に配慮したまちづくりというものを行っております。屋上庭園にはですねカワラノギクという絶滅危惧種を植えておりまして、駅前の再開発でありながら非常に生物の多様性に配慮したという整備をしています。防災対策という意味でも区立公園にですね防災トイレを設置したり、双子玉川ライズの中にも自家発電の設備を設置したりといった対策を行っております。施設の中ですとか、あと隣接の区立公園にですね雨水の貯留槽というものを設けておりまして、一定レベルのですね雨水については貯留をして洪水を防ぐということに対しても対策を行っているという施設でございます。
私たちのまちづくりではグリーンシティを体現したいという思いが非常に強くありましたので、省エネであるとか自然エネルギーの活用というのには非常に力を入れてきたつもりでおります。具体的にはですね、屋上緑化ビオトープの他にも雨水やそれから厨房の排水を再生して再生水として利用するであるとか、結果としてですねリードの ND というまちづくりの部門で当時世界では初ということでのゴールドメダルを受賞したということで、サスティナブルなまちづくりというものがようやく形になったかなというふうに思っております。
都心と郊外の間にオフィスビルですとかホテル、住宅、商業施設といった複合施設を開発するということで、結果として食住近接のライフスタイルというものを実現いたしまして、これがコロナ禍においてもですね通勤の削減ですとか密集の回避といったものが実現できているというふうに考えております。そういった移動の削減などが環境負荷の低減というものにもつながっているというふうに考えております。
二子玉川は電車鉄道だけではなくて、実はバスもですね発着の場所になっておりまして、もともと交通利便性が非常に高い交通の結節点だったんですね。でその役割を地域のアクセス拠点というものをきちんと成熟させながら TOD というふうに申し上げましたが、公共機関を使って安全で安心な街の来街につなげるというところを一つ大切な思想として持っております。非常に大切なキーワードとしては歩舎分離というものがございまして、駅から約1キロぐらい離れてますが二子玉川の公園まで一切その車と交わることなく歩いていくことができるウォーカビリティシティというものと、あとそれからバリアフリーというものをきちんと計画の中に取り入れて、子どもから高齢者まで安全で安心して街を楽しめる。この二子玉川の再開発というのは10ヘクタール以上の非常に広大な敷地の中で行っておりますので、駅という鉄道のターミナルと、それからバスあるいはタクシーのような車両のターミナル、これを非常に合理的かつ効果的に全体の計画の中で配置しているというものがございます。それぞれの鉄道と車両というターミナルをガレリアという名前のセンターコリドーでつないで、またそこもですねにぎわいで機能をつないでいく、開発エリア全体の人の流れというものにつなげていくというような、そういったところを狙っているところがあります。
二子玉川ライズは積極的に地域の方と連携してまちづくりを進めているというふうに伺っておりますけれども、どのような取り組みをされているんでしょうか。
防災対策におきましても、帰宅困難者が発生した場合の受け入れというものに関する協定も締結をしております。また地域の方との連携ということで申しますと、タウンマネジメントという手法を導入いたしまして、地権者の皆様とですね公開空地等の運営というものを一体で行っているものでございます。
例えばその自然の活用とかですね、周辺の公園との連携とか、そういわゆる地理的な連携と行政の方々と人との関係との関係としての連携とか、いろんな意味で地域の方々皆さんと連携されているということですね。
各街区の代表者の皆様から構成されております二子玉川ライズ協議会といったものがございまして、地域コミュニティの醸成ですとか街ブランディングとにぎわいづくりといったものをイベント等を通じて行っておりまして、結果として地域のブランド化ですとか地域価値の向上、また経済的な持続性の可能性の向上といったものを図っております。また各地のに設置しております広場ですとか屋上庭園ビオトープなどでもですね、皆様一人一人が自由にこの場所をお使いいただくというプレイスメイキングの考え方を導入しております。防災ですとか環境関係のイベントといったものも行っておりまして、例えば環境関係で申しますと、屋上に農園があるんですけれども、地域の方と収穫をするというようなイベントも行っております。気候変動リスクですとか環境対策といったものはこれからより重要になってくるというふうに考えております。河川に隣接した建物でもございますので、洪水リスク等といったものにも機敏に対応していきたいというふうに考えております。アフターコロナというものも見据えますと、食住近接という意味ではこの二子玉川ライズが担える役割というものは非常に大きいのではないかということも考えております。二子玉の町全体の価値向上というものに引き続き尽力していきたいというふうに考えております。
二子玉川ライズがより発展してですね、地域とか環境とかそういうものに貢献して発展されている姿を眺めさせていただければなと思っております。本日はお忙しいところありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. And from now on, I would like to invite Mr. Ota, and would like to hear his comments on the sustainable and continuous development in post-COVID era. Thank you very much for your participation. Hello everyone, good afternoon and good evening and probably good morning as well. Let me start my presentation. Please show the presentation. Thank you very much. And next one. Yes, this is my introduction. I have worked in the different projects in the urban development and the transport network design, and I worked in London as well. And I have some interactions with World Bank as well. 2 years ago, I worked on this Sao Paulo project with the South Korean people as well. And I talked about Shibuya back then, but I'm going to focus on Futako Tamagawa today. First of all, I would like to talk about TOD. Well, the idea here is to utilize the areas along the railway line effectively. In Japan, we want to create this concept of ensen. That means the areas along the railway line and developing that. So yeah, please just continuously click on the buttons. Anyway, so we have a center of Tokyo and you have a railway constructed to the suburban areas, and we develop the areas along the railway lines. And the idea here is that people live in suburban areas and work in the center of the metropolitan city. And if you look back the history, the Ebenezer Howard back in the 90s in London, they talked about the garden city concept, and Eiichi Shibusawa was very amazed at that concept and brought that concept to Japan. And Ichizo Kobayashi, he was a founder of a company in Kansai area in Japan called Hankyu. And he carried out Dainen Toshi, or garden city concept. And putting together, this garden city concept was developed and advanced by the private sector players. And you can see Daein Chofu picture at the bottom. Tokyo Railway Company established Tamagawa Toshi city in the suburban area. This was developed by Mr. Goto, father and son. So this project was continued and developed over 25 years. And Futako Tamagawa, I'm going to talk about today, is located between the big suburban areas and the central business district of Tokyo. And you can see Futako Tamagawa sitting in the big railway line going in the southwest from Tokyo, central Tokyo to. And as you talked about earlier, so this project utilizes the area along the city, the railway station very effectively, and we have a complex of businesses and commercial facilities and residential tower apartments. And this is the bird view picture. And you can see the station on the right, and you can see the business areas and the residential area. Could you please go back? Yes, this one. In between the station and the transport plaza, you have to have some certain distance. Ideally, you should have this transport plaza right next to the station, but we couldn't do so. So we decided to have a complex building called Galleria. This is the indoor view of Galleria, and because of COVID-19, so the people could not access this area in big numbers, so crowd is very limited. But anyway, this is the transport plaza area. Because we have a vast area, vast space, you can utilize the space effectively for different events. This is the office. The Rakuten, the Japanese company, is headquartered in this area. Previously, Rakuten had headquarters in Shibuya or Central Tokyo, but they decided to move from the Central Tokyo business district to Futako Tamagawa. But the business areas, the business clusters have started to pop up outside of Tokyo Central Business District. So for example, Setagaya and Setagaya. And this Futako Tamagawa is one of those clusters of business areas. And because we have garden reserves and parks, and this was one of the events of a Segway tour. We were arranging a lot of those tours and events before, but because of COVID, we had to suspend those events. Anyway, the next characteristic is that we are involving communities and local stakeholders to go and advance area management and development. And next one, and this one, because we have a public spaces along Tamagawa River, and we organized a lot of different events to have advance more vibrancy in the communities near Futako Tamagawa. This is an art exhibition along the Tamagawa River. This is the art paint event. This is probably difficult for you to recognize, but it's the foot and legs basis of the bridge over Tamagawa River. This is the opening event of a rave event. I'd like to talk about the impact of COVID-19 from now on by utilizing several slides. This is the number of passengers carried by Tokyo-based railway companies. Back in April in 2020, the state of emergency was declared. So after that, the number of passengers decreased very significantly. After hitting the bottom, the number started to recover, but still, as it stands today, it is about 80% of the previous high. So we don't know at the moment whether these numbers will go back to the previous high levels before COVID. Another important or interesting indicator is the office vacancy rate. What you're seeing here are the developments or changes of office vacancy rates of 5 major wards in Tokyo. As you can see here, the vacancy rates have been increasing steadily simply because a lot of major employers in Tokyo area are asking their employees to stay at home and do the remote work. Because of this, well, the Japanese private TOB was based on the fact that the people live in suburban areas and work in the central business district. But that is become the thing of the past. And in the future, in the post-COVID area, people do not commute to the central metropolitan area to work, but they may live and work in the different suburban communities. And those communities will become sustainable communities. We call it a Greenpeace model.
Next slide, please. So there's one thing that's important. Next to Futako Tamagawa, across the river, there's another town called Mizonokuchi. So if you cross the river, you go to Mizonokuchi, and you have to do area management in that area as well. Here's a hazard map. This river is called Violent River. So the two communities in both sides of the river have to be strong enough to be resilient to those floods and other problems caused by the river. The most important thing is the area spread into the southwest area towards the river. This is Tokyo's initiative for sustainability. So Tokyo has established this business model. Oh, this is my last slide. And we are trying to upscale this to many different areas. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Ota. And thank you, Tamaoka-san, if you could come on stage.
I know he is standing by virtually. Thank you.
So thank you once again. We have seven minutes left for the three of us to discuss a little bit. First of all, I want to ask Mr. Ota a question. And I'll come back to you, Mr. Tamaoka, later, because you've already done a video interview, so I'll be asking you questions later. So my first question for Mr. Oda is about what you covered during the presentation. Because of the pandemic, the flow of people have changed dramatically. So private sectors, private railways have been working very hard to think about how to address this issue. I'm also, as one citizen, I am aware of the change in the flow of people. Do you think this is a temporary move? Or will this continue even after the COVID? Because we see a big change in the flow of people and the way citizens use railways. It seems to be not really a temporary trend, I am thinking it might spread across the country. Yes, one of the features of Daintoshi line is that it covers Futako, Tamagawa, Plaza, and Machida. So in each station, we have shopping malls. This is something you can't see in other private railways. So you see shopping malls so far away from the stations. But in case of Daintoshi line, TOD management have been well managed, have been well done, even up until now. So shopping is about buying things. But going forward, in the future society, station has to be having the shopping functionality and working functionality as well. And of course, also the living functionality. Futako Tamagawa used to be a living area, but it has to expand to a more multifunctional city. So before I move on to Tamagawa-san, I have another question for Mr. Ota. This question comes from Party Girl, who's from Nepal. So I was listening to her presentation, and I've been interested in the Greenpeace model. You mentioned that it'll come in handy in order to establish a sustainable society. What are the logics behind that? That's a great point. We're only thinking that it might be a viable model. So one thing I can say is that this is a general guideline. And we still need to prove that this is a viable model. So that's actually exactly the issue that we're addressing. This is only my private, way of thinking, personal way of thinking. Thank you so much. So I understand that Tokyo Railway has ambitious goals and that they're working very hard. And that's good to know. Now let me go back to Mr. Tamaoka. I was so impressed by your video presentation. So after watching the video, it seems like I've already met you, but it's actually my first time meeting you in reality, virtually. So Tokyo Railway is, of course, a private railway company, but you do a lot of development initiatives. How do you achieve that? How do you talk to the people in the community, and how do you actually reflect those opinions to your development initiatives? So during the interview, we talked about the initiatives that we've done with Futako Tamagawas. So for example, education for children, how to valorize the community. And we hold workshops in order to address these issues. And we're getting direct touch with the people in the community. And that is how we can kind of absorb the voices of the people in the community. And in terms of how to develop a city, the fact that we established Futako Tamagawa rise was a big step forward in itself. So once we built that building, we also had to think about how to co-live with the local community. So it was a collaborative approach. We try to work together with the people in the community. And Futako Tamagawa Rise was also participating in the initiative very proactively, which was very important. When it comes to initiative led by private sectors, you often go against public sectors, and you might not really think sufficiently about the people in the community. And that has long been an issue of area management. But this is a good example where that has been well managed. Thank you. We have only 1 minute to go, so let me quickly wrap up. So the two gentlemen before the session talked about green recovery, which does not start after the COVID pandemic. Futako Tamagawa had already started the initiative 10 years ago and 20 years ago, and we also talked about reliability and workability. Going forward, we would the use of spaces will be more human-centered. Cities are where people live and work, so it has to be well accessible by public transportations. So public transportation or transportations in general is another key issue that we need to keep on thinking about. And Futako Tamagawa was a good example where it had both the town itself and the accessibility. So I would advise people from many parts of the world to come and see the actual project.
Ota-san and Tamaoka-san, I would like to invite back Victor. Thank you so much.
Tamagawa was a good example where it had both the town.
Thank you, Haruka, and thank you to our speakers, Ota-san and Tamaoka-san. It was very enlightening to learn about the concept of green cities with metro regions through the Futako Tamagawa case, and inspiration for urban regeneration, livability, and greener sustainability. And with this, we conclude today's segment that is open to the public. Thank you to all of you that have been watching via Vimeo stream. It has been a pleasure to have you today.